Y'all know John Vercher?
Hi, John.
If you don't, you should.
Do you want to introduce John
Oh
Vercher?
yeah,
All
yeah,
right,
yeah. He wrote a
let's
he
do
wrote a
it.
beautiful, beautiful novel last year called Three Fifths. It was Edgar finalist for best first novel. Should have won for best first novel, um, and I blurbed the hell out of it. It was one of my favorite reads last year. So if you don't know John's work, or if that book's not available at Malaprops, it needs to be.
I'm
Uh,
sure I'm sure it is. And
yeah.
Patricia, when we get caught up, we'll post a link to it as well as to your book.
Man, this
All
is
right.
this is supposed to be your launch.
I'm better at selling other people's books.
We're
Thank you for
all
that.
we're all about it. Welcome, John.
And thank you, David. That was
Of course.
unnecessary, but I appreciate it.
No, no doubt.
No, that's awesome. It is my pleasure to welcome David Joy back to Malaprops, although it's virtually in this case. David Joy is joining us this evening from here in North Carolina, not too far away. He's the author of The Line That Held Us, which won the 2018 Seabook Book Prize, The Weight of the World, and Where All Light Tends to Go, which was an Edgar finalist for Best First Novel. His stories and creative nonfiction have appeared in a number of publications, and he's the author of the memoir Growing Gills, A Fly Fisherman's Journey, and a co-editor for Gather at the River, 25 authors on fishing. His new book, When These Mountains Burn, was released today, and we celebrate that release and congratulate you, David. And it received a rave review in USA Today, in addition to a ton of other rave reviews. And we are so excited to welcome you this evening, David.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, and thank all y'all for coming. Um, it's actually, in some ways, less awkward reading my books online versus in the store because if you've ever been to a reading at Malaprops, you know they shove you in the children's section, and anybody who knows me or knows my work knows that's not a very appropriate place to stick me. And so a lot of times in the past, I'm bad to cuss, and I get to cussing, and I look around, and there's little kids all around me. So maybe this is better, maybe it's better to shove me on here. Uh, I thought I would read for maybe about 5 or 6 minutes, and then we'll just open it up to straight questions. That's pretty much what I always do. I'll tell you a little bit about the novel, if you hadn't seen it, it looks like that. So when these mountains burn is uh, told during the 2016 fires, and if you're not from Western North Carolina or Appalachia, you may not be as familiar with that. But you probably did see on the news Gatlinburg burn, and I think a lot of people were familiar with that event. The truth was that our mountains had been burning since September. By that point, we'd been having devastating wildfires for 3 months. Um, and in the background of all of that, we also had the election. And what this novel really became about in a lot of ways was I had these two characters who I think both in their own way felt like they were witnessing the end of the world. And I think, and when I try to think about a contemporary time when that felt true, especially for me, the fall of 2016 felt like the world was ending. With the fires and the election and everything that was going on. And so I said it very deliberately then. But it's the story of a father named Raymond Mathis, whose son is a heroin addict, and Raymond's kind of on his last breath trying to save this kid, and isn't really able to. He's not able to help him. And then on the other side, we've got a heroin addict, and these two stories are kind of running parallel, and then eventually start to intersect. And honestly, I think the book, I've never been good at saying what a book's about. That always seems like a philosophical question to me, and I think people typically want a plot synopsis more than they want a thematic explanation. But thematically, this book is largely about it's about the opioid crisis in Western North Carolina right this very second. and it's about the loss of a culture. It's about culture. And on the one hand, you've got Raymond Mathis, who feels that he is witnessing the death of mountain culture. And on the other side, you've got Denny Rattler, who is a member of the Eastern Band, and he's witnessing a revitalization of culture. And the book largely became this juxtaposition of how two communities are responding to both of those things, the opioid crisis and culture. And I figured the part that I would read today, it's actually it's really late in the book, but it's my favorite section of the entire book. And if I'm going to share it with anybody, I'm going to share it with people at Malaprops in Western North Carolina where they actually might get it. But it's, like I said, it's probably about 6 minutes long. And ultimately this scene is about a death of a culture and about what Raymond Mathis is witnessing. The coyotes wailed on the hill behind Ray's house that night. He couldn't sleep, so about midnight he crawled out of bed and went outside to listen to them yip and howl. Temperatures had come up over the weekend, leaving the night air to hover in the low 50s. A few days shy of December, the mountains felt more like early fall than winter. Ray walked out into the yard and stared straight overhead. The wind kicked up and shreds of clouds raked across the stars. A waning crescent moon was carved back to an eyelash that for now held still, but would slowly float down toward the ridge and disappear by morning. Ray sat down in his rocking chair and pushed himself back on his heels. He was barefooted and the ground was cold against the soles of his feet. The coyotes were really singing, and Tommy Two-Ton clawed at the front door, but Ray would not let the dog out because for now he just wanted to sit there and listen. On the way home, he'd forgotten to ask Leah to swing by the store, and once he was at the house, he didn't feel like going into town. He was down to his last cigar and had already smoked half, having stubbed it out on the arm of the chair a few hours before. He pulled what was left from the pouch in his pocket, struck fire to the end, then waited for his eyes to resettle from the strike of light. A coyote began to howl directly behind the house. The animal was close, maybe 75 yards up the ridge, so that Raymond could almost feel the sound resonating against the back of his neck. Across the holler, the howl was answered by another, then another, a series of calls strung together by intervals of distance so that it seemed that what started at a singular point might stretch on in every direction the entire world over. The calls quickened into a high-pitched symphony, an eerie and beautiful wave of dissonance as if God were running his hands over a theremin. Raymond closed his eyes and let the sound come through him, bury itself someplace deep that for a long time nothing else had been able to touch. All of a sudden, the great conductor flattened his hands and the woods fell silent. Ray waited and listened, but as quickly as it had come, it had vanished, and that was the way of the world. His mind turned instantly back to what had been troubling him over the past week. He was grieving the loss of a place and a people. It was hard enough to bury the bodies of those you loved, but it was another sadness altogether to witness the death of a culture. There was the gone and the going away, and there was the after. He found it difficult to imagine what would become of this place, harder still to witness what it was already becoming. For years, he'd been trying to put his finger on the moment things started to fall apart. As silly as it sounded, sometimes he blamed it on the arrival of television. When people could see what folks had on the outside, they started to want those things for themselves. They heard the way people spoke off the mountain and slowly began to change the way they talked. Things that seemed trivial and harmless at the time, looking back, had signified a beginning. But even before that, before the outside began to press in, the communities were breaking apart and the people were leaving. When the timber was gone and the mountains were left as naked as the moon, families packed up and headed west to places like Oregon and Washington where the trees had yet to be touched. Jump forward 60 years, and it was the same old story when the paper mills shut down, when the old plastics plant at the south end of the county left, when Dayco laid off everybody in Waynesville, or when Acosta disappeared from Brevard. The jobs came on slick-tongued promises from outsiders, driving fancy cars and dressed in fancy suits, and left again folded in their ostrich skin wallets when everything that could be taken was took. The people ran desperately behind them, waving their hands to the dust and exhaust, dusty and exhausted, out of breath, beaten and broken, and when they finally keeled over and stopped, they looked around to realize they were standing in places unfamiliar, that they were lost as turned around dogs. Those who stayed raised their children to do better. They told them to go to college. They told them to get an education so that they could find a good job, one that didn't leave their hands calloused, their skin cracked, their bones broken and mended. We don't want you to have to work like we did. That was what they said, and it was a noble thought with an ominous end. Instead of remaining rooted to the place that carried their name, they took their names with them when they left. The very fabric that once defined the mountains fragmented and was replaced with outsiders who built second and third homes on the ridge lines and drove the property values so high that what few locals were left couldn't afford to pay the taxes on their land. Of course, there were the drugs. There was the decade of meth, the transition to pain pills and needles, and that wasn't a mountain problem so much as an American problem. That was the escapist cure for systemic poverty, the result of putting profit margins ahead of people for 200 years. And when it all boiled down, that was the root cause of it all. It wasn't just a matter of economics. It wasn't the drugs. It was an abandonment of values. It was trading hard work for convenience. It was marking the nearest Starbucks as a place more important than the front porch. Ray remembered the old days. He remembered being a kid and how when Dottie Dills needed a new roof, the community got together and built it themselves over the course of a weekend with smiles on their faces, food in their bellies, and laughter hung in their throats. They did it for no other reason than they were neighbors, and it was something that needed done. Nowadays, people didn't even know their neighbors' names, and what was worse was that they didn't want to. They sold off their heritage and bought it back in the form of bumper stickers. They strutted around in T-shirts with mason jars on the front, wearing the word Southern Charm with a disillusioned pride, wholeheartedly believing that those two words and that single image somehow represented where they came from. They'd all run off and left themselves. They'd run off and left the very best parts of themselves. Now everyone was sitting around watching the last of it flicker like a sunset with eyes blind and minds dumb to the fact that when the night finally came, there would come no light again. The very nature of things demanded that there would come a moment in history when hopefulness would equate to naivety, when the situation would have become too dire for saving. Raymond knew this, and it was that final thought that had left his heart in ruins. That's the end of that scene. It's a real hopeful book, as you can as you can tell, like all of my other books. I guess we'll open it up for questions, and you can ask me anything.
Excellent. I was, yeah, it was an amazing reading. So I know that it's going to take a minute for people to get their questions together.
Okay. Yeah.
Because we were all just listening, and thank you for that. Yeah. God playing a theremin.
Yeah.
You just go, David. So we do have one question so far, and this is inspired by what just happened. David, what will it take to have you narrate one of your novels? Are you gonna do the audio version for us sometime?
No, and I've always joked that the problem would be that it would be like a 500-hour audio book. You know, I'm a slow reader. My draw is real drawn out. So you know, if I was to try to read that book, hell, it'd take a month to listen to it.
Well, I mean, I feel like the not to blow smoke or anything, I feel like the point of that question was that probably folks would be perfectly fine
Yeah.
listening to you read for a month. So
Sure.
we'll just put that out there. Okay, we have another question. This one's from Charlie. You always seem, oh, hold on just a second. Pardon me, folks. You always seem committed to honestly following the consequences of your character's actions rather than contriving a happy ending. Do you ever have to resist the urge to try and save a character?
Uh, I, I don't think that I ever. It's not something that even I really consciously think about. My books tend to not have happy endings. I don't know many people. I'm not friends with many people who have had happy endings, if we're being absolutely honest. And so the characters that I'm writing about, a lot of times I don't even know that that's necessarily an option. At the same time, the ending of this book uh, feels more hopeful to me, maybe than any other book that I've written. And I think that was in some ways odd for me. But yeah, I think I'm more interested in capturing emotional accuracy more so than I am providing a reader with a happy ending. And maybe I mean, if we're being honest, that's probably why my books don't sell that sell that well. I think a lot of readers, especially American readers, prefer a happy ending, and that's not really. I'm more interested in forcing a reader to think about big issues than I am providing some kind of Hollywood ending.
Well, and so reading reviews of the books, this book in particular, just out today, for instance, it's described as a crime novel, and as being an excellent read just as a crime novel, right?
Yeah.
But and you're obviously getting at a lot more than that. Speaking of, not sort of succumbing to any pull to make up a happy ending. Can you talk a little bit about how the crime novel serves your deeper purpose in terms
Yeah,
of what
yeah,
you want to communicate in a book?
yeah, absolutely. I was fortunate enough to sit on a panel in France once. It was in Vincennes at a festival called Festival America, where they invite a bunch of American authors I think it's every 2 years. Um, but I sat on a panel with Megan Abbott, who is a hell of a lot smarter than me, a hell of a lot more talented than me. If you don't know her work, you need to. Um, she's just a hell of a novelist and just savvy. But one thing that she said during that event that has always stuck with me since then is she said that the crime novel, perhaps more than any other genre, has the potential to serve as the social novel. Um, and I think that's a really accurate statement. I think if you look at what's happening culturally in this country right at this moment, how could you write a novel about America that wasn't about crime, that wasn't about violence, that wasn't about police brutality, that wasn't about the haves versus the have-nots, that wasn't about all of these things? Uh, you couldn't. Or if you did, it wouldn't be a book about America that I'd be interested in reading. Um, and so for me, I think uh, it's largely that. And the other thing for me is that I've tended to write um, from the other side. In that historically, most crime fiction, you had a detective, or you had a cop, or you had this or that, and that's not something that I've ever understood nearly as much as I've understood the addict, the petty thief. Those are just the people that I've feel a lot closer to it, and it seemed like I have a better understanding of their motivations anyways. This novel is a little bit different in that I do have a DEA perspective that pushes through the entire novel, and that's not really something that I've done in the past. But yeah, I think if you're writing about America, uh, especially during this moment in time, and you're not writing about these things, then I don't have a clue what in the hell you would be writing about.
Yeah, the term criminal certainly has opportunity to come up at all levels these days, I think. Yeah. And is an important thing to keep in mind. We do have several more questions coming in. I'm going to selfishly take a moment to ask another one that occurred to me while you were reading. We're talking about the fires here in Western North Carolina, and it brought to mind, what space you had to inhabit to know that was happening or to care about it. And a conversation we had with another pair of regional authors recently about one of the many biases and isms that is so prevalent in our society right now, which is this sort of anti-ruralism. And that there's not as succinct a piece of terminology for as there is for racism or sexism. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, in addition to the fact that you were looking for an apocalyptic setting, about writing about something that loomed so large for people in this area and for particular sets of people in this area, and even another subset of people in Western North Carolina in particular, and in Appalachia in particular, that looms so large for some people, but went completely missed for other people, and what that might say about another statement about our country and how things sort of shake out.
Well, I think the great crisis for Raymond Mathis is witnessing the loss of the rural identity. About a year ago, he's a Peabody Award winning documentarian. He'd done a bunch of really great war documentaries that he won a bunch of awards for. But anyways, he reached out to me. He was putting together a series for PBS, and the idea was that he wanted writers to be an avenue into place, and so he wanted writers to tell the story of a place. And so when he asked me to do that, it was like, sure. And I started. My thing was that I wanted to put him in the right hands. So like I took him to an old black AME church in Colowee that's one of the oldest churches in Jackson County, because this region and this place continues to be whitewashed. I took him to Cherokee, and I introduced him to a great novelist there. She's just had her first novel come out, Annette Sanuk Clapsaddle, Even As We Breathe, and she met us at Gadua, which is the birthplace of the Cherokee. And I took him to all these different places. And I really didn't have any specific motivation in doing that, other than that I wanted a whole lot of perspectives. But what wound up happening was I wound up learning that the history of all places is a story of displacement. All places. And so when we're talking about this place, it was the Cherokee were really the first peoples that were displaced. And it got me wondering if one of the reasons that I care so much about what's happening right now with rural mountain culture, I think one of the reasons it's so personal is because it's my culture. It's the first time that I'm witnessing that from my end, versus the reality is that displacement has been happening everywhere, whether it was the black communities in Asheville being forced out, the black community that was in Colowee and in Jackson County being forced out, and so you deal with all of these stories of displacement. But as far as the rural identity, we're a generation to two generations from cultural extinction. I mean that wholeheartedly, and I don't know that I'm not a very hopeful person to begin with, but I don't really see any way out of that. I think about where I come from. My family had been basically in the same little 10-mile area since the mid 1750s. And the last real piece of family land I can remember the city coming and they basically told my grandmother that she could sell to them or they would force her out with eminent domain, and they were going to use this land for an airport. Forced her out, took the land. Airport winds up never using it. 20 years down the road, the city donates that piece of property to Amazon as an incentive for them to bring jobs into a community. That's the history that's the history of my life. That's the history that I'm witnessing over and over and over again. That's the history that I'm witnessing right this second in these mountains. These people are being priced out. The jobs that we had was a tourism industry that people refused to recognize as an extractive industry for decades and decades and decades. They shoved it down our throats, and now once these people have come here, they don't want to leave, and the people who were here can't afford to stay here any longer. And there's really not anything that can be done at this point. You know, I've spoken a lot recently about rural connectivity and the availability of broadband. You know, and in some ways, I thought, man, that's a step that we need in order to level the playing field. And then the other day, I woke up thinking about this. I woke up thinking, man, the minute we get that, all we've really done is made it even more accessible for people to work remotely from the outside. I don't see any way out of this. The values that I grew up with, the values of the people that I know and love, is something that is not valuable on the American landscape anymore. And I don't see any way around that. You know, like I said, I think we're a generation to 2 generations away from extinction.
Do you see any space to be made to preserve any parts of what makes rural culture as you see it, even as those changes are made? I mean, looking at, for instance, what's happened to indigenous populations, and the work that's gone into maintaining what has been maintained. I get that you're not hopeful, but what do you see as a possible future that wouldn't perhaps be a complete annihilation?
If you're talking about traditional mountain culture, I don't. I really don't. But the juxtaposition of that in this novel, especially, this novel, I made a very deliberate choice to write across race, which is you damn sure better get it right if you look like me, because if you look like me, there is a long history of cultural appropriation and exploitation and getting the story wrong and stealing stories to profitize on those stories. And the reason that I chose to write across race was because I wanted to juxtapose these two communities. I wanted to juxtapose Jackson County and Cherokee. And so I've got this character, Denny Rattler, that's an enrolled member of the Eastern Band. And so at the end of this novel, you know, that section I read was what Raymond was witnessing. What Denny's witnessing is the opposite. If you're familiar with this area, or if you're familiar with Cherokee, especially over the past, 20, 30 years, you know that there was a pre-casino reality and there was a post-casino reality. And pre-casino Cherokee was rubber tomahawks, headdresses, teepees, peddling anything that you could to the tourists to compete for those tourist dollars, because that was the only means of survival. Post-casino Cherokee is what good socialized programming could look like in this country. It's every kid that grows up there has the ability to go to college if they want to. It's that they're putting money into mental health services. It's that they're putting money into addiction services. it's that 20 years ago you had a language on the brink of extinction, and now you've got children being raised as native speakers. Um, I'm proud of the things that they're doing in that community. And that's not to say that it's all being fully utilized or that everything's perfect there, but that is to say I think that they're consistently making the right steps uh, to invest in that community. And what that looks like one generation, two generations down the road, I think is a very, very positive thing. At this point, you've got kids who, even if they want to go to college, maybe their parents didn't go to college. Sometimes it's as simple as they don't know how to fill out the paperwork. But you get one more generation down the road where now you had all of these first generation college students. Well, that next generation, I got news for you, they're going to college. Uh, and so for me, it was about juxtaposing those two things. I am hopeful for a place like Cherokee. Um, and so if there's anything that I'm hopeful about in these mountains, maybe it's that. It's that.
Well, and that's something for sure. Yeah. So let's get back to audience questions, and thank you for that. Thank you for that thoughtful answer. So we have a two-part question. Christopher Swan is another author and asks, how do you start your novels? From a character, from an event, from an image? How do you decide to end them? So two-part question.
As far as starting a novel, this one I think there was the main thing was a real story. The past two novels have started with real stories, and it's kind of funny or ironic, I guess, that I'm sitting where I'm sitting. I don't have internet at the house, so I'm sitting at a firehouse in Cashers, and a fireman's letting me use his bedroom so I can do this. But there used to be a man that was a fireman here, and his son got really, really bad off on drugs, and he owed a pile of money. And he told us a story once about going to buy his son's life back and driving up the side of a mountain with a shotgun in his lap and $10,000 in the passenger seat. I wanted to tell that story, and so I started with something real. I started with that. And then at that point, I could kind of let it go. The other character, Denny Rattler, if I'm being honest, that character started with a singular image at a midget wrestling event in Cherokee, and during the middle of this midget wrestling match, this one of the wrestlers jumped up on the turnbuckle, and he had a can. It looked like Aquanet hairspray, like one of them big tall cans of 80s hairspray, and he had a Bic lighter, and he lit that lighter, and he hit it with the hairspray, and a big flame went out over the crowd. And I remember looking down, and there was a Cherokee man there that was gooned out of his mind on dope, and he looked like he was witnessing Jesus. And I just had that singular image of that guy, and that's Denny Rattler. That was the birth of Denny Rattler. So then I've got these two characters and start playing around with how a story develops. And they were running parallel for a while, and then the story starts crisscrossing. As far as the way that a novel ends, I don't think I ever have any idea where a book is going. I follow blindly. I think what I try to do is I try to get to know the characters intimately enough that you could ask me anything about them and I'd be able to answer it. You could ask me. I've always joked and said if they might not eat at the Waffle House, but if they did eat at the Waffle House, I know how they'd order their hash browns. And I want to know them that intimately, because once you know that, you can drop those characters into any situation and you know how they're going to react. I tend to write a more reactionary narrative where I can't ever see any further than the headlights. And basically, when I run out of road. I run out of road and the book ends.
Well, that actually brings us very nicely to the next question. This was from Rosemary, who's also a bookseller at Malaprops. And she's asking, without spoilers, it seems a few of the characters could merit a novel on their own. Will you continue on with someone in this book?
No, that tends to not be the kind of stories that I write. It's never really interested me. Even series, like I've never, I can really only think of one series that I've ever read from start to finish, and that's Ace Atkins' Queen Coulson series. Mm. And other than that form doesn't interest me. I tend to, right now I've got all these other characters in my head, and when that ends, there'll be another set. They tend to kind of show up when I'm reaching the end of a novel. They're either already in the back of my head, or they really start coming to the forefront as I'm getting to the end of something. At the same time, I've always sprinkled kind of Easter eggs into novels, so that if you have read my other work, a lot of times you recognize somebody in the next one. The sheriff that's in this novel, he was in the last novel, because that's the reality of a place like Jackson County. Even if you don't know everybody in the county, you've seen them before. You just can't help but do that in a place this small. And so I try to use the fiction to mirror the reality.
So the next question is a little bit more, it's not as much about process, but maybe it speaks to your comment earlier about folks buying your books. David, do you ever envision any of your novels ever becoming a movie?
Yeah.
And would you be opposed to that? Which I think is the more interesting part of that question.
No, hell no. If it pays off the house, it pays off the house. My truck, I went riding around with the dog earlier, and hell, I thought my truck was going to blow up. So if they can buy me a new truck, I'm all for it. I think the reason that person's asking that is the fear that they ruin it, or that they get it wrong. And I think my answer has always been, I was at a reading once that Ron Rash was giving, and it wasn't long after Serena. And if you've seen that movie's horrible. And somebody asked him, they said, "How do you feel about them ruining your book?" And he said, "They didn't change a word of my book." And I thought that was a brilliant answer. And then they asked him something else, and he finally just cut them off, and he said, "It bought me a house." And it was like that, that was the perfect answer.
Yeah.
All of it, all of my novels at this point have been optioned, except for this latest one, and that's, it just came out. But all of these novels have been optioned. The truth, though, is that Los Angeles is a fickle place, and so who knows? Who knows if any of that's ever going to happen? I was talking to a writer earlier named Camille Perry that wrote When Katie Met Cassidy, and that novel was 6 months or so ago. HBO picked it up and was gonna make a movie of it, and I said, I'm really looking forward to seeing that because I loved that book, and she said, it was up in the air, because that's just the truth of Los Angeles. Who the hell knows? That's an odd bunch of people out there.
Well, and I think that's a really common story, is that it is very easy to option the rights to a book and let it sit on the shelf. And I think that happens a lot. And it's sort of like publishing. It's actually interesting, sort of what ends up getting greenlit and what doesn't. So, but I suppose we'll all just hope that if it happens, that they do a good job, and that if they don't, that it at least, gets you a new truck.
That's right.
So we have a comment, and that question was from Steve, by the way. I was trying to remember to mention first names and have not been doing a good job. So thank you for that question. And so Norma asks, or starts with a statement that your voice came through so powerfully in your reading. I had not thought to even ask this question. Do you write out loud? What techniques do you use to get at that voice, to get the voice to come through on paper?
Well, I think I'm driven by poetry, and I always have been. That's still my favorite thing to read. Yesterday I read a new collection by a writer named Noah Davis. That man, I ain't gonna be able to remember the name of the collection, but it was gorgeous. His daddy was another poet named Todd Davis, who's he writes a bunch for Gray's Sporting Journal, a bunch of kind of natural history poetry. He's brilliant too. But I love poetry, and I think maybe if I go back and try to figure out why, there's probably lots of reasons for that. One might be some of my influences, so like William Gay, Ron Rash. They tend to write sentences like that. Ron's obviously a poet, but if I go back further, it's probably a tradition of oral storytelling, which is what I grew up with. I wasn't a huge reader as a child. I grew up in a very rich oral storytelling tradition, listening to uncles and aunts and cousins and grandmama and listening at church. I'm very, very interested in the way that a sentence sounds. And it's very interesting to me that you can force rhythm upon a reader through meter. Especially a scene like what I read. There's not a word in that section that isn't meant to be there. The repetition of when that car's going down the road and that scene of that rich man leaving and in the dust, running through the dust and dusty and exhausted, that repetition, that's very, very deliberate. I'm trying to play with the way that something sounds. I think about the very first novel I wrote, Where All Light Tends to Go, in the last chapter of that book. There's not a word that's not meant to be there. It becomes very lyrical to me, especially in sections. The other side, you can't really maintain that type of lyricism through an entire novel, or it can bog a reader down. And I'm also interested in creating a more propulsive story. I want a story that moves. I want a reader to get to the end of a chapter and realize it's time to pick the kids up, but glance down at their watch and count how many pages are in the next chapter and think, I can sneak one more in. I want to write that kind of book. And so I think it's a combination of those two things. But yet, what makes me happy as a writer, and what I find the most enjoyment in as a reader, is when a sentence really sings. When it carries that really audible quality.
Well, that's definitely happening. And you mentioned Ron Rash, and he talked about hating to write novels. And he's talked a lot about being a poet, and he writes short stories, and obviously he's written several novels that have been wonderful. But just sort of dreading translating into that form, the way he writes. Do you find it challenging to make, you talk about maintaining particularly a sense of lyricism in
well, I think I'm the opposite.
Is it hard, or?
I'm the opposite of Ron. Ron owns the short form. The New York Times in this latest review said he's one of the greatest living writers that America has. And I think that's absolutely accurate, especially if we want to talk about short stories. You could pin him up against any short story writer alive in this country, and he owns that form. He just does. I think I've thought before, if I could have one book on an island, it would be that Something Rich and Strange, which was the collected of his. But yeah, his mind, I think, works very differently. And this is from me watching him. He would write So one, he was always very methodical. He always sat down and he worked every day, and everything had to be just right, and then he would work. He would tend to start with poetry. And he would work on getting a couple lines, maybe just a couple lines, maybe a whole poem. Um, but I think it was his way of finding his way into the language. That was his avenue in. He's also had a really long history of writing uh, poems that then became short stories, and in some cases then became novels. So he's expanded on it. But I think the way his brain works for the most part, as far as craft, is through a distillation. And so I think what happens for him is that when he thinks about the novel, it's too big of a landscape. I think it gives him anxiety, and for me, it's an opposite anxiety. I'm incapable of working in a place that small. When I think about that collection of poetry that I read yesterday, some of those poems might not have been 30 words long, but they carried the weight of a novel. Uh, I've always said that those three forms all have to carry the same amount of weight, and I mean literal weight. Like, let's say that it's 100 pounds, and a novel has to weigh 100 pounds. Well, if it has to weigh that, then a short story has to weigh 100 pounds. And if a short story has to weigh 100 pounds, a poem has to weigh 100 pounds. And I've always been incapable of creating that amount of weight within that amount of space. And I tend to think there are very few who can do all of it. Ron's a wild example. But then I think about a writer like like George Singleton. He's another. He owns the short form. But if you were to ask him about a novel, it confuses the hell out of him. His brain just don't work like that.
So, well, fortunately, we've got all y'all working in the different spaces to kind of balance out. So, it. With that being said, looking at it being a different process, you have written shorter pieces. You've obviously been publishing novels and are known for novels. Do you see yourself going back to publishing a collection of short stories
Never.
at any point if you would like to?
No,
Yeah.
no.
Okay.
I don't think we have to worry about that.
Okay.
I think I've.
So George and Ron don't have any competition from Tim.
No, if I look back, it's odd because that's really the form that especially in this country, that's the form that we push on to writers as young writers. It's you try to teach them short stories. Well, that is a hard ass thing to try to teach somebody, and some people never get it. And so of all the short stories that I've ever tried to write, I think I can only think of one example that I would even consider good. And the truth is, when I got to the end of that short story, I didn't know where to go. And George Singleton gave me advice on how to fix it. And it worked because his brain works that way. I think about a writer like Leah Hampton, who lives in Waynesville in Haywood County. She just had a collection come out called Fuckface. And that entire collection is absolutely brilliant. One, she's just one of the smartest writers and smartest people I know, period. But two, she has a very, very good understanding of what makes that form work. And that has always been something that has eluded me.
So I ask another process question, and actually a couple folks have asked about COVID-19 in a couple different ways. So one of the questions is about your writing process in general, and just if you have a writing rhythm, like do you have times that you write? Is it every day? Is it consistent? That sort of thing. And if that's been affected by the pandemic.
Yeah, I've never been somebody who writes every day, and I talk about Ron a lot, but that's because when I was a young writer, I got to watch him, and how I was talking about how he set everything up and he worked every day. As a young writer, that made me feel inadequate because I've never once been like that. I don't write every day. Uh, and then, one day I found a old interview. I've said this a lot, but I found an old interview by Raymond Carver in the Paris Review, and he started describing his process, and it was, he said, when I'm not writing, it feels as if I've never written a word a day in my life, and it was like, that's me. And he said, but when I am writing, he said, it's what John Asbury called the paddle wheel of days. He said, it's just one day dovetailing into the next, into the next. That's very much me. So I might not write for a year. I might not write, you know, for 2 years. And at the same time, there are things developing in the back of my head. I just mean that I'm not physically putting words on a page. And then it'll hit, and hell, it wouldn't surprise me if I wrote a book in a month. I think about Where All Light Tends to Go. I wrote that novel in 5 weeks. And I wrote it working 2 jobs. I was going to my first job at 8, got off at 5, second job at 5:30, got off at 9, got home at 9:30, cooked supper, and worked from about 10:30 to 4 in the morning. And I did that every day until that book was done. And it was because I didn't have any other time to work with, and the other side is that there was an immense compulsion to create. And as time has gone on, I think I've learned to just trust in that process. If I think about how I've matured as a writer, that's probably one of the biggest things is learning to trust in that process. And I don't feel the pressure to do it any other way anymore. As far as how COVID has affected my process or my writing, I don't think that COVID has, but what we're witnessing racially in this country at this moment has absolutely affected me. In that I was writing a novel. So there was an event that took place at Western Carolina University. This was back before it was a university. It was Western Carolina College back in the 1920s. But there was an AME church there, and when that university expanded, they basically forced these people to dig up their dead and move the church down the mountain. And I knew this event, and so and that community has kind of been erased from the history of this place in the way that the Black existence has been erased from the Appalachian story, period. This place has been whitewashed and continues to be whitewashed. Rural culture in general continues to be whitewashed. But so I was writing about that, and I was writing about this community coming to terms with racism in all of these different ways. So in some instances, really simple things or things that seem small but carry really big implications, and then in other examples, really overt racism. And I was trying to write this book dealing with a whole lot of these issues. And what has happened is that all of that has taken place in real time, to the point that, like, a couple weeks ago, the county commissioners were voting about the Confederate statue that stands over downtown Silva. And these people are quite literally at each other's throats in downtown Silva. And so I started witnessing all of the things that I was trying to write about in real time, and it became incredibly debilitating because I couldn't separate the two things. At the same time, that's a luxury for me as a white writer. I'm making a deliberate choice to write about race. That's not a choice that any person of color gets to make. That's an expectation. I could write as a white male writer. I could write about any damn thing I wanted to. As a Black writer or a Latin writer, or anywhere else across the board, their story carries the expectation of it being about race. I was talking to someone yesterday, and I was thinking about the writer Maurice Ruffin, who wrote a novel called We Cast a Shadow. I think that's one of the most brilliant novels of the past, 20 years. And when I think about Maurice is never mentioned as a Southern writer. Uh, he's he's mentioned as a Black writer, uh, and both of those things are absolutely true. But where you choose to place him says a whole lot. And choosing to take him out of the South allows you to continue to say all of these other things about the South. Um, and so I think a lot about that. But yeah, I think it's been a really debilitating time for me personally to try and write about these things. And at the same time, I'm very aware that that is a luxury and a privilege afforded to me because of the way that I look. You know, it doesn't get any more, as ugly as I might look, it don't get much more privilege than this.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, David, and I appreciate you saying it, because especially when we're talking about whitewashing in Appalachia and in rural spaces in general, it's always struck me as so odd that, you know, when people hear the word farmer, for instance, they're always going to picture like a white man in overalls and not picture the Black and brown people who have actually been connected to the land in these very important ways this entire time, and who have been, you know, producing food and making wealth for other people. And
I mean, you think about a writer like Jesmyn Ward. We talk about Jesmyn Ward as a Black writer. We don't ever talk about Jesmyn Ward as a Southern writer or as a rural writer, when every damn one of her stories is set there and it's about those people. I think about a writer like Crystal Wilkinson from Kentucky, or Frank X. Walker, a poet from Kentucky. It quite literally took them it took Frank making up a word for them to be recognized for what they were. It took them making up the word Afro-Latchin to even be considered Appalachian. When the reality is of course those people were here and are here. You know, I think about one of the biggest cultural shifts that's taking place in Jackson County, where I live right now, and it is the Latinx community. I've continued to say that I think the next mind-blowing perspective that's going to come out of this place, that's what it's going to look like. It ain't going to be somebody who looks like me telling an Appalachian story. It's going to be one of these kids down here, you know, writing about his mama and daddy owning a tienda. You know, that's the reality of this place. I think about a writer like Sean Cosby. You know, he just had the novel Blacktop Wasteland come out. S.A. Cosby, very much rural noir, and maybe for the first time ever, that's kind of what it was placed as, and that's the conversation we're starting to have, and that's been nice. You know, I mentioned John earlier, John Vercher, that's in on this with his novel 3/5. I think we started to have those conversations with that novel. You know, and so I think maybe there are some shifts that are taking place, and I think we're starting to recognize some of our failures as stewards of literature, as readers. And so maybe some things are starting to change for the better. Regardless, I can tell you flat out that some of the best literature, if not the best literature that's coming out of this country right this second, is coming out of people that do not look nothing like me. You know, I think I keep mentioning that novel, Maurice Ruffin's We Cast a Shadow, but it's because, my God, read it. When he wrote that novel, they tried to tell him it was satire. And then jump forward to this year, and people are looking at it, and it is quite literally exactly what's happening, and he's laughing because he never meant it as satire. He meant it as reality, because that was the reality he'd witnessed his whole damn life. So when I think about the most important things that are coming out, Ryan Amilcar Scott, his short stories. I think about those, both of those collections. The World Doesn't Require You was the name of that last collection, and I sat with those stories for probably 2 months, and I went back and read them again because I didn't fully understand them. So what I'm getting at is just that we're witnessing a cultural shift that is long overdue and is important, and at the same time, as a reader, like, how could you not be enjoying the hell out of this? I mean, the books that are coming, we're experiencing an absolute renaissance in American literature, and as a reader, I'm just amazed at the things that continue to come out year after year.
Well, I have to agree. And I think, part of it is, publishing, eventually catching up to where people might actually want to be, and not being so exclusive about, who ends up in print. And then part of it is just like people, readers, sort of demanding better and more.
Yeah. Yep.
And of course authors like yourself, and also sort of speaking out in this way and in solidarity, and using the privilege that you claim,
yeah,
to elevate other voices. So yeah, I think it is an important time, and we are pretty fortunate. We talked to Sean Cosby not too long ago, and I noticed that as well. The fact that, it was heartening to see the book described as a noir novel, as talking about rural life, mentioning that it, of course, it is very much about race, but that's not all it's about. Talking about it as a crime novel, but not pigeonholing, as basically marketing as a as a book that's just about and for Black people, for instance. So I think that's something to be hopeful about.
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
There you go. Yeah. So there's some hope in there. So I just realized that it's a little after 7, and because we could keep talking to you for a long time, but we shouldn't do that.
Yeah.
So thanks everybody for sticking with us. Really,
you said you were going to ask me about my favorite books.
Well, here's the thing. So, and please do stick with us for a few more minutes if you can. So one of the things that we like to do at the very end is ask authors for a list of things they're reading or would like to recommend. Of course, this whole time you've been doing that, which is awesome. And everybody, before you leave, make sure to check out the chat and copy and paste those titles and links from the chat. But yes, if you would like to give us a couple more of maybe what you're reading right now, what you're particularly excited about, that would be great.
Yeah, well, my favorite 3 novels of the year are Andrew Krivak's The Bear. That's my number 1. It's a gorgeous book, and he was somehow able to write a myth, and as a storyteller, that's a hell of a task, to be able to write a myth, and so that novel. My second favorite novel is probably, and if I mispronounce this, I'm really sorry, Nguyen Phan Way Mai's The Mountains Sing. But it's a novel about it's a multi-generational novel about imperialism in Vietnam. Gorgeous book. This month, Stephen Graham Jones' The Only Good Indians. Man, that novel's got, somebody's holding it up.
Yeah. Thanks.
That novel, the opening of that's one of the best openings to a novel that I have read in ages. And then I think about some of the books that have been coming out of Appalachia. I mentioned Leah Hampton's Fuckface, but that collection is absolutely brilliant. I mentioned Annette Saunooke Clapsaddle, her novel "Even as We Breathe." That's an important novel for a whole lot of reasons. Uh, but for one, it's the very first novel to ever come from an enrolled member of the Eastern Band. We've had Cherokee novels in the past, but they were all written by Oklahoma writers. This is the first novel coming from here, and so that novel's you know been brilliant. Earlier this year, Carter Sickles, The Prettiest Star, that's super important book. And so yeah, I think it's interesting because we've got so much good stuff coming out right now. It's hard for me to be, I know a lot of times, and especially in popular conversations, especially this year, there's been a lot of hard conversations about publishing, and those hard conversations need to continue to be had. But damn, I'm hopeful to think about all of these books that are coming out and these books that I'm reading.
Yeah, I share that hope. It's kind of, there are always so many books published that it's a little overwhelming, but it's actually, there's kind of a good overwhelm now, where you see new and different voices being published every day, ones that that you would be hard pressed to find,
yeah.
Even just a few years ago,
yeah.
At the same pace or in the same quantity.
I saw an this is a little off topic, but I saw an anthology today. To give you a perfect example of this, it was an anthology celebrating African fantasy, and there was like 30 writers, all African writers, all writing a very specific genre. That wouldn't have happened 5 years ago. It damn sure wouldn't have happened 20 years ago. And I don't care anything at all about fantasy, but when I saw that, it was like, man, I wanted to check it out because I knew for a fact it would be unlike anything that I've ever read, or anything that I've ever encountered. And so, yeah, I think absolutely, week after week after week, there are books coming out that are changing the way that we should look at the world. And I think about the short story writer George Saunders. He said one time, he said good literature has the ability to serve as empathy's training wheels. And I think that is absolutely right. The more we read, the more perspectives that we kind of delve into, the better off we're going to be.
And we now have all of this verifiable proof of something we already knew, which was that there's plenty of space for everybody.
Oh, hell yeah.
It's not some zero-sum game where if we start putting new voices on the scene, then all of a sudden, the white male authors aren't gonna have a place to go, right?
No.
And it's not like, I think there was a lot of people who didn't need proof of that, but some people did, quite honestly.
Yeah.
So yeah, here we are. Well, thank you so much, David. We've just really enjoyed hearing from you this evening.
Thank you all for joining me.
Yeah, thank you again. Thank you all for those of you who stuck out way past the 7 o'clock mark. We appreciate it, and we look forward to the next time. Whenever you put something else out in the world, we will be there.
Hopefully, it'll be in person.
Yeah, we do look forward to that too. We're glad that this is an option, but it's not our preferred way to do things. We're booksellers. We're not video tech geeks. So so we look forward to seeing you back in the store. Everybody, if you haven't picked up David's new book yet, we encourage you to do that if you have the means to do so, and to buy it either from Malaprops or another local independent bookseller. And if you don't have the means, the librarians are awesome and will hook you up. And we just appreciate all the support that you are giving to us and to writers like David Joy, and to your own communities in whatever way you're doing that. Because now is a time where that's absolutely necessary. So Thank you all so much again. And David Joy, thank you so much. And congratulations
Oh, thank you.
again on your book, published today, pardon me, When These Mountains Burn. Everybody have a wonderful evening.
Yeah. Y'all have a good, safe evening.
Yeah, everybody take care. Thanks so much. We
Yep.
really appreciate it.